Hi, this is Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. Right now in America, we've allowed, and this has been for some time now, and I've done several videos and talks and sermons about the fact that race has become like the number one issue, it seems, in America, aside from the pandemic, of course. But race, if you've been following the 2019 movement or even my YouTube channel, I talk about it and I try to break it down because there's so many different levels and so many different nuances that what we've allowed is the media to promote the idea in a way that makes it very not deep, so very shallow, if you will. And we have to look at it from a different perspective. Not only do we have to a deeper perspective, instead of being very spiritual, and a spiritual from a spiritual perspective in a way that really encourage you to please, share the one thing of us have read and a lot. Acts chapter 17, beginning with verse 24. This is Paul in Athens. He's on Mars Hill. He's having this talk, and verse 24 of Acts 17 says, God that made the world and all things therein, and the and then he goes on to say that made out of one blood all nations. Now, let me break it down to you in the Hebraic mindset. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heaven and the earth, right? So that's who he's making a reference to. We look at it from that Hebraic mindset. We know who the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega is Jesus, right? So he made out of one blood all nations that dwell on the face of the earth. True foremost is there really isn't a such thing as race. So we talk about racism. Racism is a social construct that was created, and it was primarily created to divide people. That's what the enemy's job is to do. When it says that he is the accuser of the brethren, that word accuser is the word categoros, which means that his primary function is to separate into categories so that he can have us not. I'm going to change my. Is to accuse us to each anthropology. They would tell you also that there is no such thing as race, right? It's a social construct that was created in order. It's about nations. So when we talk about race, we're talking about three primary races, right? Some people look at four, but three primary races. So you have Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid. Those are the three races. And so because we get caught up in that and we equate it simply to skin color or regions that they come from, it's an easy manipulation tool. It's called a psychological operation. A psychological operation is something that is used to shape public opinion and also to get what's known as groupthink. Groupthink is when you can get everybody or a large portion of people believing the same thing. And so that's what race does. Race has been created. It was created a couple centuries ago as a way to not only separate people and divide people, but also to promote the idea of slavery. So when they began to enslave people, a lot of people from the African continent, they created they are less evolved than European people. That's how they promote the idea of slavery. But since there's no such thing as race, it was building from a foundation right from the door, a foundation, a false foundation. And that's what the enemy does. And many of us buy into it, and we get manipulated by it. And primarily we get manipulated by it because we are, my internet connection is being a little bit slow, so please forgive me. It's easy to be manipulated by because when we allow the enemy to shape the narrative, it literally creates an idea that's based on a false premise, and now he controls the narrative. So it's like anything. It's like whoever is able to shape the narrative or control the narrative is the person who's able to set the boundaries and set the rules. And because the enemy has come up with that concept of race, he's also shaped the rules, shaped the narrative, and it makes it easier to manipulate us as human beings. So race is a social construct. It doesn't exist. The Bible only talks about nations. And God didn't equate it to skin color. He equated it to nations, and the nations were blessed based on whether they follow God's laws or not. That's what he based it on. Not had nothing to do with skin color. You got to realize that throughout the scriptures, it never makes a differentiation based on skin color or race, only by nations, and they're blessed if they follow God's laws, and they were cursed if they didn't. Just think about when Moses was in Egypt, right? Moses, who was a descendant of Shem, and Egypt, which is descendants of Ham, they lived together, and nobody knew the difference between them, right? Moses lived in Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh was he was the head, and he convinced people that Moses was his grandson, or I won't say he convinced them. People were convinced that Moses was his grandson. Therefore, Moses must have shared the same similar attributes than Pharaoh did and the people of Egypt, right? So that just goes to show you, it has nothing to do with skin color, has nothing to do with race. It's all of nations and who's blessed and who's not blessed. So, but anyway, let's get back to the talk. So we talk about the creator, the one who created the heaven and the earth. That's talking about the Bereshit. And when you look in Hebrew in Genesis 1:1, it tells us that it's the Son of God who created everything, which we know is Yeshua. But it also tells us in Genesis 1 that let us make man in our own image and our own likeness. That's the word Adam, right, for humanity. It's when God took man out of the earth and framed him and put his spirit inside of him. And the name Adam in Hebrew is spelled Aleph, Dalet, and Mem. You don't have to memorize this, but Aleph, Dalet, and Mem. So Aleph is the strong leader of the ox, also a symbol for God. The Dalet and the Mem, which are the second and third letters of the word Adam, spells the word in Hebrew for blood. And so when God created man in his image, he created man to be the DNA or the bloodline of God. That's why it says, be fruitful, multiply, take dominion over the earth. So man's job originally was to be the bloodline of God. Now, of course, we know what happened with Adam. When Adam sinned and he was separated from God and he lost his proper authority. So then God had to send Jesus, who was actually the creator, who created the heavens and the earth. He is the Bereshit, the beginning and the end. He comes, and when he comes, he causes a new bloodline. Right. That's why it says you have to be born by the spirit and the water and the blood. So you're under a bloodline. You were originally under Adam's bloodline, which is the cursed bloodline. And then when you get born again by the Spirit of God, now you are in God's bloodline once again. It is a reconciliation. You're being reconciled back to God and his original intent and purpose. Right. So originally you were under the bloodline of Adam, which was the cursed one. And now you are, if you're born again, by faith in Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, now you are born again and you're part of God's bloodline again, God's DNA in the earth, right? So understand that there's only two races. Only two groups of people, those who are under Adam's bloodline or those who are under Jesus's bloodline. That's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when it talks about Jesus and his resurrection, we are resurrected with him when we're born again, and now we're of the bloodline of God, and it calls him the last Adam. So you have the first Adam, which brought death through his rebelliousness, and then you have the last Adam who brings life through his bloodline, or the bloodline of God, when he shed his blood on the cross, right? So this is what Paul is talking about. There's only one blood that everyone was created under, one race of people, the human race. And so, but we also, as I said, that the enemy has created these false barriers, these false boundaries of people in order for us to be separate and for him to accuse us to each other and have us hating each other. Now, I know a lot of people, and even in the mainstream media, who promotes the ideas of racism and how horrible racism is. But what they do is they just shine the spotlight on tragedies that happen between people of what is called quote unquote race, right? But if you look throughout human history and you look in the world as a whole, that black versus white or one race versus another is not the worst thing that happens in humanity. And what do I mean by that? If you look in China, when the communist Chinese took over China, there were about 50 million Chinese people, between 35 and 50 million is estimated, were killed, tortured, and thrown in jail with the communist takeover. Now that's Chinese against Chinese. They will all be considered the same race. If you look in Europe during the Second World War and the other times in history, it was estimated that about 20 million people or more got killed, brutalized, or whatever in Europe when these various governments took over, right? And they would have been Europeans versus Europeans. That would be considered the same race. When you look in Africa, there was horrible, wars in Africa. And even when you understand the whole notion of the transatlantic slave trade, when the Europeans went to Africa, they went there and there were enslaved Africans that were traded by other Africans. And even in Africa today, if you look in Libya and other African nations, slavery still takes place. It's Africans enslaving Africans. So what we're really dealing with is a sin issue, but because racism, quote unquote racism, has such a good marketing team, which the mainstream media and different things that they've written throughout history, it's promoted as being the number one thing that we're dealing with, which it isn't. It isn't. So anyway, and here's the part: when we become spiritual people, as being born again by the Spirit of God, we should not only understand what the Scripture says and what the Spirit of God says, but we have to have discernment so that we don't fall victim to the things that the enemy is promoting and pushing. Because if we know that God's original intent was for all nations, as He said through Abraham, to come together in Christ, that's His ultimate goal, then we should also recognize the strategy and the devices of the enemy, which is to separate us by what is known as race or skin color or those type of things, ethnicity, right? When we understand that, then it means that we shouldn't fall victim to the devices and the schemes of the enemy, and we shouldn't allow him to control and to manipulate us like he has been, right? When your feelings and your emotions get manipulated by the enemy, it means that you're buying into his strategy, right? You are actually worshiping him because you're giving worth to his narrative over God's narrative. And so when we understand this social construct, and we understand that how the enemy is trying to use it to control and manipulate the masses, then we shouldn't fall victim to it. And we have a higher understanding or higher learning, and we should help to fulfill God's purpose and his plan, and not give in to the purposes and the plans and the schemes of the enemy. And so anyway, keep your eyes and ears open. Don't keep falling victim to the psychological operations that the enemy is doing, because when he frames the narrative and you react in accordance to his strategy, scheme, or agenda, whatever you want to call it, then you're actually giving life to it. And when we don't, then we're able to operate and function as God's bloodline, his DNA in the earth. This has been Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church, also the founder of the 2019 movement. Until next time, peace and blessings to you.